Good morning, Year 12. I hope you're all well. Hope you had a nice weekend. And looking forward to another productive week of history work, amongst other things, of course. Hopefully you've all just done that quiz that I set for you on quizzes. That was the equivalent of the fact test that I was going to do with you on Thursday, but we ran out of time. Please keep doing it till you can get full marks. I imagine most of you that's going to be very easy, but please do make sure you get full marks on that test before moving on. When you're ready, we can start having a look at our final unit of the Anglo-Saxons course. We've almost completed the entire course at this point. Just to remind you what we've done. We've done all of Alfred. We did Alfred and the Vikings. We looked at the Renaissance. We looked at how he changed governance. We've done all of Edward the Elder and all that went on with him. We've done Athelstan. We've just done the 3 Years unit, which had quite a lot of kings in it. And we're now moving on to our final unit, which is this one here about Athelred, the final sort of king of this period that we need to learn about. Now, Athelred has quite a long and quite eventful reign. Okay, spoiler alert: at the end of his reign, the Vikings win. Okay, they are back with vengeance for this unit. So it's quite a nice one to finish with. Everything kind of kicks off a bit again, and it all gets hopefully quite exciting. So we're going to start today at the beginning of his reign, which immediately begins with drama. Okay, there's a bit of a crisis in terms of the succession, and it's that backlash to the monastic reform that I've been talking about for quite a while that really kind of kicks off at the end of this reign. So today we're going to have a look at what the problem was that led to that. So why was there a contested succession? What was the challenge there? And secondly, how does that then cause this quite large scale kind of violence across the country that breaks out? And we'll do a bit of that today, and then we'll finish it off on Wednesday. So we've got 2 keywords today that are going to be quite important to understanding what goes on with Athelred. The first one is degree of consanguinity. Consanguinity. What that means is it's a legal term technically, and it means how closely you're related. So what is your blood relationship with someone? So con meaning kind of two in Latin, and then sanguine, which is blood in Latin. Okay, so how closely are you connected by blood? Okay, how closely are you blood related to someone? Okay, obviously that's important because you don't want to end up marrying somebody that you are very closely blood related to, because obviously then you end up with all kinds of unfortunate birth defects and inbreeding and things that you don't want to happen. And of course it's seen as quite against God as well. So the degree of consanguinity is really, really important, okay, when it came to Anglo-Saxon marriages. It's going to be quite significant in what we're doing today. The second word is one you've probably heard, but you may not necessarily know very much about, which is Antichrist. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about kind of the full picture of what Christians believe happens at the end of the world. But the Antichrist effectively is the bad guy. All right, he is Christ's kind of big opponent, okay, his big rival, so the Antichrist, okay. And the idea is that just before the world ends, the Antichrist is going to come along, muck some stuff up, cause some trouble, and then Jesus is going to have to come in and save everybody. Okay, and that is quite related to that millennialist teaching we talked about in our lesson on Edgar's coronation, and it also becomes quite a big, important concept in the reign of Athelred too, because of all the drama that happens. Okay, so we'll come back to that in just a second. So there he is, Athelred. So Athelred, you may have heard of his name, if nothing else. So he's known as Athelred the Unready. Okay, now a lot of people kind of misunderstand that nickname. It doesn't mean he wasn't ready. Okay, it comes from the Latin rede. Okay, rede, which means counsel, advice. So technically his name is Athelred the poorly counselled. Athelred the receiver of bad advice. Okay, which is obviously not ideal if you're a king, and we'll see as this course goes on potentially where that name might have come from. Okay, but we'll come to that later. So in short, the Vikings come back. Okay, they come back pretty much as soon as his reign begins. They're there right till the end, and as I say, ultimately it escalates to a point where we have a Viking king of England. All of that kind of drama and action and conflict gets linked in the eyes of many to this concept of potentially the Antichrist. Okay, this idea that we're getting to the year 1000, the end of the world is approaching, and that these pagan Vikings are kind of the heralds of that. This is all the drama that comes before Jesus comes back. So, just to make it clear to you, I think it's probably worth, I don't know how good your Christian eschatology is, but let's just quickly run through what some Christians believe is going to happen at the end of the world, just so you can understand where a lot of this thought is coming from during the Anglo-Saxon period. So, basically, this is the timeline the Christians have got. We'll stick some dramatic music on this. Okay, so we start in year 0, that's when Jesus is born. Jesus comes to earth, he lives his life, he teaches, he preaches, he spreads the word of God, yada yada yada. When he's 33 years old, he's killed, he's crucified, dies for everyone's sins, comes back to life at Easter, we all eat lots of chocolate, he goes up to heaven, and happy days for everybody, right? We then have 1,000 years of peace. We have a golden age where everything's going great, and pagan beliefs have been swept away, and everyone believes in Jesus, and everything's great. Jesus gets to rule the earth effectively, okay? And at the time of the Anglo-Saxons, a lot of them believed that's what they had been living in. All right, it may not seem particularly golden by our view, the period they lived during, but as far as they were concerned, it was better than before, because they now knew about God and they were Christian and so on. So they felt, okay, we're in this golden age of peace, that's going to happen for 1,000 years. Just before the end of that, the Antichrist is going to show up. There he is, you can see, clearly evil, right? And we're going to have this period called the time of tribulation. And this is where your 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are going to turn up. You've got famine, plague, war, all of that kind of thing. I don't remember what the 4th one is. They're going to come along, they're going to cause havoc. As you can see, there's all this horrible misery happening in the background of this picture. The Antichrist is going to rule over the world. It's going to be a horrible time. Everyone's going to have everyone's going to really suffer, and so it's going to be awful. But then Jesus is going to come back. Come down from him, there he is. Okay, he's going to come back. He's going to fight off the Antichrist. Okay, you can see that going on over here. He's going to save the world, and then we're going to have the final judgment, where all the sinners get banished to hell forever. All the people that are good get to be resurrected and live with Jesus, and then we have eternity, which is going to be the happy ending, where all the good people get to live with Jesus and God, and everything is great. Okay, so as I say, there's this kind of idea of millennialism around this time of the Anglo-Saxon period, approaching the year 1000, where they think there are 1,000 years, their golden age is up, and therefore we're approaching the second coming. Now, we saw that a lot in Edgar's coronation. He tried to push all that propaganda to connect himself with Jesus and make people think, oh, we better follow him, because he'll lead us to a good outcome, he'll help us navigate this horrible time. Edgar dies, Edgar the Peaceful dies, golden age of peace is up, and it's all going to go horribly wrong, and tribulation is going to begin, and the Antichrist is going to show up. Unfortunately for Athelred, when he becomes king, all of the Viking attacks and violence that follow that, in the eyes of some, were interpreted as the coming of the Antichrist and that time of tribulation. Okay, so just to give you that kind of background, that's where that belief comes from. Okay, we can cut the music. So, we're going to start by having a look at some sources about the kingdom at the end of Edgar's death. Okay, because Edgar, as I say, he's been a very successful king. He's been a very strong king. He hasn't really had to deal with any opposition at all. He's steamrolled through all these incredibly unpopular monastic reforms. He's made the government stronger. He's polished a lot of those systems that he inherited. He's used propaganda to elevate his own kingship so he becomes even more powerful. It seems like he's been doing good, right? However, as of his death, things unravel very, very quickly. Okay, so it turns out the kingdom perhaps wasn't as stable as it might have seemed. All right, and what I'm going to ask you to do is answer that question by thinking about all of these 4 things. Okay, I'm going to talk you through those sources now, so that you can consider perhaps what they mean. So we'll look at source A first of all. Okay, let's find that. So, this is another one of those extracts from the Chronicle that are written in heroic alliterative verse. Edgar's doing that quite a lot. We'd only really seen it prior to this at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. Later, when Edmund recovers the 5 boroughs in 942. Edgar just keeps dropping this style. He loves it. It's all part of that propaganda drive he has to make his kingship seem more important and more kind of significant. So, unsurprisingly, we got it at the coronation and we're getting it again when he dies. Okay, so let's read what it says. Here Edgar, king of the English, ended earthly pleasures. He chose another light, radiant and happy, and abandoned this poor, this transitory life. Men name the month that the young Edgar, ring-giver of warriors, departed from life, the month of July, i.e., he died in July, right, on its 8th day. And his son afterwards succeeded to the royal kingdom, an ungrown child, leader of earls, whose name was Edward. So, this wonderful, fantastic king, yeah, ring giver of warriors. So if you remember, the ring giving is sort of where you reward your followers with literal rings. It's where Tolkien, who was an Anglo-Saxon scholar, that's where he got the idea for the Lord of the Rings. All right, so you give them the rings. It's what everyone wants. The nice, generous king. He dies on the 8th of July. He's succeeded by an ungrown child, Edward. Then, as I have heard, praise of the Creator was felled to the ground, widely and everywhere, in Mercia. Many of the wise servants of God, i.e., the Benedictine monks that have just been put in all these reformed monasteries, were scattered. That was great grief to those in whose breasts bore a burning love of the Creator, i.e., if you like Jesus, you don't like monastic reform being ruined. All right, you don't like all of this carnage that seems to be happening. And then also the bold-hearted hero Oslac, who was the ealdorman of Northumbria, was driven from the country over the rolling waves. And then up in the heavens appeared a star in the sky, which men learned in science, wise soothsayers, widely call by the name of comets. The ruler's vengeance, the ruler, capital, God, was widely known. Famine over the earth throughout the nation of men. So what events are we getting happening in this single extract? Right, we've got the king dying. We've got the king being succeeded by a child. We've got some drama whereby religion seems to be being massively disrupted. We're getting monks being scattered in Mercia, okay, to the great grief of those who follow the true religion. No prizes guessing who the proper religious people are. Dunstan and co. Got the ealdorman of Northumbria being driven from the country. No real explanation as to why, but for some reason he's been kicked out. And then up in the heavens appeared a comet. So we've got famine, we've got a comet, we've got the ealdorman of Northumbria being kicked out of the country, we've got some major violent reaction in Mercia where monks are being attacked, we've got a child on the throne. Doesn't sound ideal, does it? There's clearly some problems going on here. All right, so consider that when you're answering this question. What sources are being described? What is the mood? You tell me. Okay, and what's the impact of the style? Okay, yet again, it's been written in this heroic style. It's alliterative poem reserved for Brunanburh, the taking the 5 boroughs, and the coronation. What does that tell you? These major events are all being recounted in this particular style. What does that suggest? Okay, what's the mood? Okay, when I was reading it, that came across. Okay, just contrast that to the extract I gave you about the coronation last week. All right, very, very different tone. Okay, let's have a look at sources B and C and see maybe what the connection between them could be. Okay, so we've seen this before. This is for Edgar. This is his law code. This is him saying that the Danes in their particular regions, so the ex-Danelaw regions, they can have whatever laws in force as they best prefer. So they can kind of pick their own laws, apart from some of them which everyone has to follow. Okay, which are the bits about, following your administrative duties and so on. And then source C. So this one is from the manuscript E of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, so it's a much later version of it. It was written in the sort of the 12th century, okay, so it's quite different to the earlier versions, such as manuscript A, which is what was copied in Winchester, and it was probably the earliest one we've got. So this one's written a lot later, and it seems to have been written in the manner of a guy called Wulfstan II of York. Okay, now we're going to meet him in a lot more depth later on in this course. But essentially, you remember Wulfstan I? He was the slippery one who kept switching sides under Eadred. This is a different Wulfstan, Wulfstan II. Okay, it's another Archbishop of York called Wulfstan, and this one is quite different. All right, he is a millennialist. He's an absolutely ardent millennialist, and he really believes the Antichrist is coming. Okay, he writes lots of sermons, i.e., big long speeches to be read in churches, about the Antichrist coming. Okay, that is a big thing. So he lives in York and he's convinced the Antichrist is on its way. And this is what he said about when Edgar took over. Here, King Eadwig passed away, and Edgar, his brother, succeeded to the kingdom. In his days, things prospered readily, in that he dwelled in peace for as long as he lived. And he readily merited this, did as was his duty. Far and wide, he exalted God's praise and loved God's law, and improved the people's security much more than those kings who were before him within the memory of men. And God helped him too, so that kings and earls readily submitted to him and were subjected to that which he wanted. And without battle, he controlled all that he himself wanted. So far, so good, right? This all seems quite positive about Edgar. He became greatly honoured wide throughout the land of the nation, for he readily honoured God's name, and deliberated God's law over and again, and promoted God's praise far and wide, and counselled all his nation wisely, very often, always continuously, for God and for the world. I.e., he was a great king, he was a great Christian, he was super powerful, he promoted God. We love Edgar. But one ill deed, however, he did too much, in that he loved bad foreign habits, and brought heathen customs too fast into this land, and attracted the alien here. Now, what we don't mean by alien here is outer space, we mean the kind of legal definition, i.e. from a different country, from a different state, and introduced a damaging people to this country. But God grant that his good deeds may be greater than his ill deeds, to shield his soul on its longsome journey, i.e. to heaven or hell. So, what is the connection there? Edgar's law code, letting the Danes have a bit of flexibility with their laws, and this kind of moaning that Wulfstan is doing about Edgar in this extract from the Chronicle. What could that relationship be? And how does that add to our understanding from source A about the instability of the kingdom that follows Edgar's death? Okay, why is that there? Final source, and we're going to talk a lot more about this in a minute, so I'm not going to spend very long on this, is the family tree of the House of Wessex from Edward onwards. Okay, obviously Alfred would be up here, but we're kind of quite far away from him now. There's Athelstan, there's Edmund, there's Eadred, there's Edgar, there's Edwy over there. So you're looking from this bit, basically. Can anyone see an issue that might arise when Edgar dies? Can anyone foresee a potential problem that we might have just by looking at this bit of the family tree? It's a problem that we've had before when Athelstan was still around. Okay, notably, got a couple of different wives, a couple of different sons. What problem does that lead to? Okay, so what I want you to do is put all of that kind of together, all of these concepts, okay, all of these things, and think about, okay, so how does this link to this idea of Wulfstan worrying about the Antichrist and kind of the coming of this kind of awful pagan time of tribulation and pain? How does that link to source A? The way that is written, the style, the events that are in there, the mood, and then what issue can we see in source D? And I want you to use all of those things. So I want you to use all 4 sources to write an answer to this question. Okay, and I'm going to ask you to post that on Microsoft Teams, okay, just so I can read it. So what do all these sources suggest about the stability of the kingdom when Edgar dies? As I say, we've all been seeing all of Edgar's praises. He's such a strong king, blah, blah, blah. Actually, though, how stable is the kingdom he leaves behind? Okay, I want you to use all of these sources to help you answer that. So, that takes us on now to the succession. Okay, you've probably gathered from that family tree there's going to be a problem with the succession, right? Okay, and interestingly, these are the 2 sons of Edgar. Okay, there's Athelred, our king, that we're learning about next. But there seems to be an older brother who was king first, and in this image, he seems to have an arrow stuck in him. So, what potentially happened and why? Okay, so what I want you to do is go through, read through the document, which is this one, about the royal succession. Okay, read through that and use that to write an answer to this question. I want you to summarise what is the issue with the succession. Okay, and then if you pause the video, do that, start it up again, and I'll explain it to you just to finish. Okay, so hopefully you've had time to read through that text, and I'm just going to whiz you through the key points that you should have pulled out. Okay, so obviously when we're looking at succession, I think again we need some dramatic music, and there's one quite appropriate that I would say for this kind of issue. Let's get that going. Okay, so this is the House of Wessex, the family tree of the kings that we have been learning about over the past however long it is. We can see Alfred at the top there, the various, I'm sort of whizzing around all those kind of key figures that we've been talking about, Alfred, Edward, Athelflaed, all of that lot. And the bit we're looking at now is this bit here, which is Edgar and his family. Now you can see he's got two kids. We've got Edward II, and we've also got another one who, if you look, is called Athelred. Now the difficulty is with the parentage. So Edward is the oldest, okay, and therefore he would seem to be the obvious heir, which is why that Dunstan and co latch onto him as somebody to promote, to kind of help their claim, though Athelred is also there. Now the issue with Edward is, well, there's a couple of possible problems, neither of them good, depending on who his parents are. Number one is potentially he is from Edgar's relationship with a lady called Wulfrith, who's quite an interesting story, that supposedly she knew Edgar was after her, to the extent she literally went and hid as a nun, so he couldn't get a hold of her. He managed to anyway, and she ended up having Edward until Dunstan supposedly found out and made Edgar get rid of her. So obviously, if Wulfrith is his mum, that's a problem because, well, they weren't married, so therefore he's illegitimate, and an illegitimate child cannot inherit the throne. Okay, kings very frequently had mistresses, bastard children, and so on. That was very common, and therefore they could not be allowed to inherit the throne, or it would get very complicated. So that's option one, Wulfrith, this random kind of girlfriend of Edgar's that maybe is Edward's mum. There is, however, another option, which is not great either for different reasons. Okay, so one option is that he is the child of Edgar's first official wife, Athelflaed Aneda, Athelflaed the White. Okay, the trouble with that is, whilst it was in theory a proper marriage, there was a bit of a concern, which is that potentially that degree of consanguinity is going to cause a problem here, i.e. they're too closely related. Okay, there may have been some suggestion that perhaps Athelflaed Aneda was actually a little bit too closely related to Edgar for it to be okay. Okay, and therefore technically the marriage was invalid and illegal, making Edward yet again illegitimate, and therefore again not able to inherit the throne. Okay, so either of those options, either of those mothers, is not okay if we want him to inherit the throne, really. Okay, so that's always going to be a little bit of a problem. Okay, however, Athelred, in contrast, to the younger son, so he's only aged 12 when Edgar dies. Okay, he is with Edgar's sort of second official wife, Elfrith, or Elfrida, as you can see on the spelling on this sort of more modernised form here. Now, that marriage is legit, okay? That was a proper marriage. Again, this like interesting story where supposedly she had previously been betrothed to Edgar's foster brother, Athelwold from East Anglia. Edgar then supposedly arranged for him to be killed in a hunting accident so that he could marry her. But either way, he did marry her. It was legitimate. She was that marriage was recognised. It was done officially. She was crowned queen, and so on. Now, the thing with the sort of legitimacy issue, particularly when it comes to degrees of consanguinity, that was probably something that a lot of families in the Anglo-Saxon period had, okay, an issue that they had, because obviously it's easier to marry within your family, because it keeps all your lands in one place. You don't have to give them to other people, because if you, let's say you have a son, if you marry him off to one of your nieces, that keeps the family lands together. So it's probably quite a common practice, actually, but it becomes quite a useful piece of mud to fling at your rivals should it be suitable for you. Okay, so particularly in this case, obviously they wanted to delegitimise Edward because the anti-reform faction wanted to have a claimant, Athelred, so they would say, oh yeah, look, there's a problem with consanguinity, it needs to be, it's not legal, we couldn't possibly deal with it. And of course, because the pro-reformers are on Edward's side, therefore, it becomes kind of catch-22 for them, because if they are supporting an illegitimate marriage, for whatever reason, then they're hypocrites, because they're supposedly very religiously minded. So it becomes a real kind of thorny issue, and as I say, it's what leads to this quite significant backlash that we're going to look at on Wednesday, where effectively the country pretty much descends into civil war. Okay, cut the music. Okay, so that's that for today. I hope this video was useful. Any questions, as ever, email me please, and I'll be very happy to help you out.